Back to this Google story as the company canceled a planned diversity meeting they were supposed to have after that memo gate and the guy that got fired earlier in the week. Lauren Simonetti joins us in the newsroom on why things were canceled. What happened here?
You know, Connell, the Google CEO, Sundar Pichai, he canceled this meeting an hour before it was about to start. It was supposed to be a town hall event. Google staffers would come in and ask questions about Google's response to, well, memo gate, as you call it, the controversial memo written by the male software engineer about women in the tech industry. Well, Mr. Pichai got worried about the safety of his workers when their questions for the town hall, they were given ahead of time, when their questions and their identities were leaked. A Google spokesperson said employees are getting harassed on social media for supporting the firing of the memo's author, James Damore. One Twitter account encouraged Google workers to expose their colleagues' identities and, quote, ruin their lives. 8 Google employees had their online bios highlighted by a well-known political commentator. So Google CEO writing in an email to employees, this is a quote, Googlers are writing in, concerned about their safety and worried they may be outed publicly for asking a question in the town hall. Google is covering itself here. Dozens of women considering gender discrimination lawsuits against the company. So this is what happened. They canceled that meeting before it started.
Well, that might be the big point there, the possible lawsuits. Lauren, thank you. Democratic lawmakers, meantime, are getting involved in all this as well, with some demanding answers on the fired Google employees' memo, claiming that tech companies in general are not doing enough about diversity. That brings up a larger question about whether there's any role at all for Washington in all this. Let's go to our panel and talk about it some more. Herald Group Vice President Sabrina Schaefer is with us. The Democratic strategist Wendy Osefo joins us, and the conservative commentator Carrie Sheffield is with us as well. I'll go to you first, Sabrina, on this. Is there a role for government in trying to level the playing field, is the way that these Democratic lawmakers would put it in Silicon Valley?
Well, no, there's definitely not a role for Washington. We should stay as far away from this as possible. But I do think that there's room for a larger conversation. Connell, you know that I believe deeply in gender differences. I do think that men and women have different preferences and aptitudes and strengths, and that's a wonderful thing. But I also think that the tech environment does have some challenges that they need to address. And I think, you know, I've talked to my Forbes on Fox friend, Rich Karlgaard, about this. And one thing that's sort of interesting is that in the 1980s, there were more women in tech than there are today, which does suggest that perhaps the sort of proliferation of online chatter and the culture there has changed in some way. And that's something that companies like Google are going to have to tackle. Well,
or that just all of us will, right? In some way. I mean, it's a discussion. I brought this up earlier in the week, Wendy, on the air, that I have 2 daughters, one's 14 and one's 12. And I said, it's true, I could easily see either one or both working in the technology industry, in that they're both interested in it, they're both interested in math. I could easily see it. But these numbers are something else in terms of how many more men than women work in that particular industry. So what's your view, Wendy? Is it something that has to be forced upon the industry by government, or something that we just need to talk about? What should we do? Should we do anything?
Well, not necessarily, but Washington has every responsibility to ensure that issues of not just equity but inclusion are not nefariously bulldozed. What we see is that women make up 59% of the U.S. labor force, but only 12% of the tech industry. To add insult to injury, we see that men honestly make 61% more than their female counterparts in the Silicon Valley. So what we have here is not just nefarious attitudes towards women in the tech industry. We also have an opportunity gap. And that opportunity gap is saying that women should not be in the tech industry. Right. So we have to really end that pervasive narrative that women are inferior, because what happens is that industries not only base their hiring practices off of this narrative, but it also affects the self-esteem of women and girls in the STEM fields.
Now, I understand, Carrie, that Google, apparently they say there were some threats against these employees, and that's why they canceled the meeting. But I do think it's somewhat ironic that we've had 2 panels in 2 hours on this discussion, on this topic, and had some pretty good discussions about it. And maybe that's what Google should have done last night, but that's just me. What's your take on all this?
Well, I think it really comes down to culture, and anytime you get government in to try to help fix the culture, there are so many negative unintended consequences that you could see it across the board in many other scenarios. I do think there is a major cultural problem in Silicon Valley. You look at some of the very explicit text messages and other harassment of women who are trying to get
so
just like a
comfortable.
man.
Women are not comfortable.
They're harassed. The men are forcing them to try to have sex with them or to date them, and they're just trying to get investment for their tech company, and they're being treated like objects. So it is a cultural problem.
Well, that's a
but
company
it's
issue, not a government issue to go in and regulate
It's a cultural problem. I mean, it's certainly, I think it's pervasive throughout Silicon Valley, but I think that's something that when it rises to the level of harassment, then that is something from, I think, a legal perspective,
And
the government should get involved. But in terms of just mass regulation, it's not going to work.
You
Yeah,
agree with
and
that, Sabrina? Do you agree with that it's a cultural, technology industry specific problem?
Well, I definitely think that there is something unique to technology, because what's interesting is that we're seeing a lot of women who are strong in math and science, but they're turning their energies to other fields where they can use that. Environmental science, architecture, biology, veterinarian school, all of these areas where women who have those strengths are choosing to go into. Perhaps it's because of the culture, perhaps it's they can create a better work-life balance, who knows exactly. But the reality is it's going to be tech's loss, because there are women who have those strengths, who have those abilities, and they're going to lose them.
What about the fact that Google wouldn't even talk about it last night? I mean, are you just accepting, do we all accept on face value the fact that, it was because of the online threats? And that can be serious, maybe it was, but to me it seems a little bit odd. Isn't that fair, Wendy, that they should at least, and that goes to the firing of this guy as well,
Right.
Even if you disagree with the guy, that we should at least be having this discussion rather than firing people.
Absolutely. We should have substantive discourse around these issues. When it comes to issues of inclusion, when it comes to issues of equity, we need to come together as a community in safe spaces and create dialogue on why these issues are happening. And to address a comment that was made earlier, when it comes to the attitudes of women in the STEM industry, it doesn't just start in the workplace. This is something, as an educator at the collegiate level, I see it in college. I also see it in high school.
Than that, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It starts in high school, starts in elementary school. It is this narrative, again, this pervasive narrative that women cannot do the same thing men do.
Well, I don't know about
that's where we
that.
have to stop.
I have to disagree.
Well, I don't think
there
she's
with
saying
Wendy.
that they can't. She's just saying that there's a narrative out there. But
I think the narrative is like when you look at women's media, you look at Cosmopolitan magazine, it's all about sex, clothing, flirting, like things that aren't substantive. Like this is what
Have you
it's
looked at men's
pablum.
magazines?
And that's the
Look at women's
narrative I'm
magazines.
talking about. It's a narrative
I
that
don't know if
women
that's
have
the-
their role and men
can I
have
just
their
throw
own
in
role.
Hold on one second.
last thing, Connell?
Yeah, Sabrina, make this the final point. We do have to go in a second, but I know you wanted to make a point. Go ahead.
One last point. If you actually look at the students who are enrolled at MIT, presumably the sort of top math and science school in the nation, even there are stark differences between what men and women are choosing to major in. Women are choosing sort of the, quote, softer sciences, which I think is a misnomer, and men are going to computer engineering and such.
Right.
And I think it's important, in this conversation, there may be cultural problems, but there also are genetics and sort of gender differences.
Right, and all of them, every single part of it is probably important to at least talk about, even if you disagree with someone on it, and you don't, which we tried to do here at least. Sabrina, Wendy, Carrie, thank you, all three of you. We appreciate it. That's Google.